Most important historical events of the medieval era is the Black Plague. This single event is closely linked to an important medieval revolution called the Peasants' Revolt. The Black Death launched reactions around Europe and the world, and finally, devastating disease led to the reform of modern medicine and medieval beliefs. The Black Plague was a medieval pandemic that swept through Europe and Asia in the late 1340s, killing an estimated 25 million people.
The age of exploration led to the sharing of ideas and inventions between continents. Unfortunately, it also ultimately led to the sharing of a devastating disease. Then, Black Plague, also known as the bubonic plague, arrived on a ship imported alongside precious silks and spices. Carried on trade ships from China to Italy, it then rapidly traveled at an average speed of 2.5 miles per day until it affected all of Europe.
People began to die of this dreaded disease just days after becoming sick. This caused a panic. People had no idea what was happening, but there were many theories at the time. Some believed that God had sent the plague as a punishment. Others believed that astrological alignment of the planets that had left the earth in a fog of death.
The actual cause of the Black Plague was a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. The Yersinia pestis bacterium was carried by fleas on rats.
Towns across Europe in the Middle Ages were crowded. Dirty places were perfect for sustaining a population of rats. Fleas were a common annoyance, anyway, and were the last to be accused of spreading this disease.
Sadly, it was another misguided superstition that allowed this disease to accelerate. For many years preceding the arrival of plague, cats were thought to be demonic and were widely exterminated, only contributing to an explosion in the rat population.
This disease would be spread through the bloodstream with an infected flea bite, but was also an airborne illness spreading quickly from one already infected person to the next unfortunate soul. Once infected, the bubonic plague caused headaches, fever, and swollen tender lymph glands, which would become black and oozed blood and pus. And that was only the beginning. Those infected would cough and sweat and spit blood. American historian and author Barbara Tuchman explained the symptoms as the following. Everything that issued the body, breath, sweat, blood from the buboes and lungs, urine, and blood blackened, excrement smelled foul. Depression and despair accompanied the physical symptoms, and before the end, death is seen seated on the face.
Populations in Europe had grown steadily from the year 1000 to 1300, at a rate of about 10 million people each century. By the year 1352, Europe's population had been reduced from 70 million to only 50 million. With a third of Europe's population dead from this rapidly spreading death, reactions around the continent were extreme. People were literally dropping dead.
This caused a panic which led to a complete disruption of civilization. Parents abandoned their sick children, doctors refused to attend their patients, priests and nuns were contracting the disease and dying in large numbers as they were quickly exposed while attending to the dead and dying. There was no one to turn to. Law and order was disrupted, and divine laws had disappeared.
As survival struggled to explain this terrible plague, various ideas developed as potential causes of this disease. Some myths associated with the Jewish faith being falsely accused of starting the bubonic plague. Jews were persecuted by being slaughtered, hung, and burned alive.
As this horrible 5 year long plague finally subsided, reactions of the survivors varied. Nearly all survivors questioned their faith. Many felt as if God had betrayed them. Those who continued to practice their religion did so in a more private way. Still, others completely abandoned the moral compass provided by the church and celebrated their survival with gluttony, debauchery, drunkenness, and extravagance. The Black Plague killed 1 in 3 people in Europe in the early 1300s. This had a huge economic impact. The feudal system in England was completely disrupted, and common laborers were in high demand. Peasants took advantage of this shortage and demanded higher wages.
In order to keep the few workers they had left, lords had to agree to grant freedom and pay higher wages. In 1351, when the king attempted to control the demands by bringing the Statute of Laborers became law. This law required that peasants be paid of the same wages as before the drastic reduction in the population.
This greatly angered the peasants and ultimately contributed to the Peasants' Revolt of 1351. This revolution had a great impact on the organization of the social structure in medieval Europe, which eventually changed as a result.
Today we have with us my mom, Mrs. Donna Kaufman. So, Mom, I see you are currently working on your doctorate.
Yes, I am. I'm a nurse practitioner, and I went back to school to work on my doctorate. It's actually called Doctorate of Nursing Practice, or also DNP.
Okay. Are you aware of the Black Plague?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I am. The Black Plague is one of those things that we studied about in public health, and it's famous for being one of those outbreaks that just we learned a lot from the Black Plague. They had just a huge bit of the population that was killed through this disease, and we actually learned a lot about sanitation, antibiotics, and hygiene practices from that outbreak.
What are the symptoms of the Black Plague?
The symptoms of the Black Plague, first the people would get real sick with fevers, nausea, vomiting. It would go on to their, they would get these swelling, especially in their extremities like their arms or fingers or their legs, but especially their legs. They had these swollen areas called buboes, and those today we would call swollen lymph nodes. But the infection was spread throughout their body, and within a matter of days they would die.
Okay. Is there a vaccine? And if there is, when was it made?
As far as I know, there's not a vaccine against that specific bacteria. The way that the Black Plague was controlled was by learning about hygiene, because it used to be in those days people just roamed around the streets with the animals, and the streets were just full of filth. They didn't have any practices to get rid of their excrement, so there was dirt and filth throughout the whole area in the living spaces, and so things like rodents or rats would be everywhere where people lived, and it's the fleas that were on the rats that had the bacteria, and those fleas would actually infect the rats, but they would infect the people too, and that's how the infection was spread. So once that was, the scientists learned that, they figured out that by keeping things clean, cleaning up the streets, using sanitation and actually pesticides to keep the rodents away, then they were able to control a lot of that. But also they found out about antibiotics, and antibiotics could kill the infection.
Okay. Has there been any recent outbreaks?
As a matter of fact, there are still some cases that of the bubonic plague. And the thing is, they don't call it really plague anymore because it doesn't occur on that extreme dimension, but there still are outbreaks, and they're able to control it because they can find the right antibiotic.
Religion, astrology, and superstition did not serve the human race well during this time. Medieval science and medicine proved to be a historic failure. The Black Plague led to significant reform of science, medicine, and even religious beliefs. One of the most important changes brought into place was the dissection of actual human cadavers. Freedom to explore the anatomy of the human body led to dramatic reform of the medical practices of the time.
This Black Plague significantly changed history forever. It is hard to believe that something as small as a flea could have traveled across continents and killed millions. This little creature is responsible for creating social and religious reactions around Europe, contributing to a revolution and initiating reform of worldwide medical practice.